Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Isaias Ghezae. Thank you for coming to my presentation titled Probing the Relationship Between Collective Existential Threat and Motivated Outgroup Perception. The work that I'm going to talk about today is work that I've done as part of the SPUR program with my faculty advisor, Dr. Christina Hawinski from the St. Mary's College of Maryland. So to begin, the U.S. Census Bureau has found that the proportion of the non-Hispanic white population is shrinking in America and will continue to shrink over the coming decades. This fact has been covered in the news and has sparked conversations nationwide about how the U.S. is becoming a quote-unquote majority-minority nation. And although some people seem to embrace this change, certain groups such as far-right activists have leveraged this fact as proof of a great replacement in which native-born white populations in Western countries are being replaced, primarily through the immigration of non-white people. And one way that this great replacement theory has manifested itself in American society is through the January 6th insurrection. And so earlier this year, an in-depth analysis was conducted by the University of Chicago to better understand the individuals who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. And what they found was that this same fear of a great replacement was the most consistent and powerful driver for these individuals' behavior, far above any other possible explanatory factors such as economic anxiety or even how close an individual lived to the Capitol. And although this study is interesting and shows that perceiving demographic change can potentially promote hostility, it doesn't explain how exactly learning about demographic change leads to intergroup antagonism. And fortunately, research in social psychology may be helpful in answering this question. Recent work in intergroup relations has studied a specific form of intergroup threat known as collective existential threat. And this is defined as the perception and fear that the group that one identifies with will cease to exist. The results of this research has found that fears of demographic change may possibly contribute to feelings of collective existential threat, which I will refer to as CET for the rest of this presentation. And in addition to the research done on CET, traditional work on intergroup relations has found that perceiving intergroup threat tends to worsen implicit attitudes towards outgroup members. And even more recent work has even found that this perception can influence how outgroup members are perceived and represented in the mind. And so given what we know already about the influence that intergroup threat has on cognition, the current project posits that CET may be a particularly relevant cognitive antecedent for how individuals construe and represent outgroup members in the mind. And so specifically the study that I'm going to talk about today posits that the fear that one's racial group will soon disappear may evoke a motivated perception amongst individuals, and specifically white individuals in this study, to mentally view outgroup members negatively. And we believe that once these representations are formed, this may further contribute to various forms of intergroup hostility and conflict. And so with all that said, the specific research question of the present study is how might CET be implicated in white individuals' mental representations of immigrants, which is a particular outgroup that tends to be antagonized by those high in in-group and racial anxiety. And so to answer this question, we're using a perceptual task, specifically the reverse correlation paradigm, which I'll soon explain. And we use this to measure how non-Hispanic white respondents from the US mentally represent immigrants versus Americans. Our study has a 2x2 between subjects design, with the first factor being the type of social group that participants are asked to mentally represent, immigrants or Americans, and the second factor being whether participants are high or low in CET. And so we measure CET through a 13-item scale developed by and Federico. A sample item from the scale asks participants to rate their agreement with the statement, "My racial group faces a threat to its existence." And then lastly, in order to get binary classifications of high and low for this measure for each participant, we will use a median split whereby the upper range of scores are high CET and lower range of scores are low CET. And now I'm going to quickly explain the reverse correlation procedure for the study. Essentially, there are two parts with this procedure. And for the first part, we need a base face. And in our study, the base face is a morph of all the male faces from the London face database. We then overlaid this base image with random visual noise to create stimulus variations of that same base image. And so this left us with hundreds of stimulus variations where each image looks slightly different from each other due to the random patterns of visual noise that have been superimposed. Next, we then take that stimuli and put it into a classification task. For this classification task, we recruited 200 white participants. Half of these participants were in the immigrant condition and the other half were in the American condition. This was a two-alternative forced choice task where participants were presented with two different images and asked to pick the image that looks more like an immigrant or an American, depending on which condition they were in. And so they do this for 400 trials. And after participants complete the classification task, we then have them complete the CET measure along with a few other individual difference measures. And then finally, for part one, we take the selected stimuli that participants chose and average all of these images together to create a final classification image, which in principle is meant to capture how that participant mentally represents immigrants or Americans. And then the second part of this procedure involves recruiting a separate sample of 400 coders. These image coders are given a random sample of classification images, and they don't know where they came from, so they're completely naive to this. These are the images that were created from part one of the reverse correlation procedure. And the image coders are asked questions about the image related to racial classification and impression formation. And for the racial classification questions, coders are asked to rate from 0 to 100 how likely this person is Black, white, Latinx, or and a few other races. And then for the impression formation questions, participants are asked to rate this person on a number of traits like trustworthiness and warmth. And so that explains the reverse correlation procedure. And before I go about mentioning predictions, I'll quickly mention what has been completed so far for this project. Under the supervision of my faculty mentor, Dr. Owinski, we've been able to complete the RBA stage of the study. I've been able to get a grant from Sci-Chi to support this research. I've already generated all the facial stimuli using R, and I've used PsychoPy, Pavlovia, and JavaScript to create the behavioral tasks and collect data. Okay. So there are a few predictions I'll mention today, though these predictions are not the only things we'll look for and analyze. These are just a subset for the purposes of today's presentation. All right, now the first prediction is that we expect immigrant classification images to be rated as more racialized, that is more likely to be perceived as Black or Latinx than American classification images. The second prediction is that immigrant classification images will be rated more negatively than American classification images. And then lastly, we expect that these effects will be particularly strong amongst those high in CET. And now I'm just going to expound on these predictions more in this next section. And so since we're still collecting and analyzing data, I currently don't have any results from the study to present, but I do have data that I simulated using R that I hope can further illustrate my expectations. And so what we have here on the left is a classification image of an American citizen taken from a study done by Joel Eduardo Martinez and colleagues that looked at how participants mentally represent documented and undocumented immigrants versus American citizens. They use the same base image that we use. And so I put this here to show just how different final classification images can look as a product of this procedure. And I mean, I also imagine that we may have similar looking classification images ourselves. And then for the simulated data, I have a figure on the right depicting what I expect the racial classification ratings to look like for the American classification image in our study. And so these are violin plots. And so what we have here is the average rating for each race, while also seeing the distribution of the data all in one visualization. And the main takeaway from this figure is that the American image will be rated as more likely to be white and less likely on everything else. And then for the immigrant classification image, I have Martinez's classification image of an undocumented immigrant. As you can see, this looks substantially different from the previous image, though it comes from the same base face. When looking at the figure on the right, we expect that the immigrant classification image in our study will be more likely to be perceived as, for example, Black and Latinx. And this was also true for Martinez's study. And then the final figure that I'm going to show here today shows the effects that I think CET will have on racial classification ratings. Specifically, I'm just going to zero in on the Latinx rating. And from this figure, we can see that my expectation is that the classification image produced by those high in CET and in the immigrant condition will be the most likely to be rated as Latinx. Second would be those low in CET and in the immigrant condition. And then finally, those in the American condition, regardless of CET, should have low Latinx ratings. And now to wrap up the presentation, I'll mention that we're, again, currently finishing data collection and working on data wrangling. Once again, the main goal of the study is to first see if the representations of immigrants and Americans do in fact diverge in the minds of participants, particularly amongst those high in CET. Depending on the results of this study, I hope to follow up with some future studies. And we do have enough funding to follow up on future studies. with future studies, I mean. And something I'll note is that in addition to looking more at CET's involvement in mental representations, I'm also interested in exploring how certain stimuli like real world news sources can momentarily bias representations of immigrants, and see if there's an influence of things like political rhetoric on visual stereotypes. And that concludes my presentation. Before I open it up to questions, I just want to say thank you to my wonderful faculty mentor, Dr. Howinski, as well as Dr. Michael Cross for organizing the SPUR program. And also I'll shout out everyone in my SPUR cohort. It was a blast, getting to know everyone and being a part of this program, though it was virtual. And so that's it. I will open it up for questions if anyone has any questions. So thank you.
Nice job. Really fascinating work. Opening up for questions. So raised hands or chat questions opened now. What are y'all wondering? Question from Allison. Go ahead.
Hi, great presentation. That's awesome. So I was kind of interested with that questionnaire, the CET questionnaire, whether, so it didn't specify the cultural context. It didn't say like US versus on the planet. And I wondered how you thought people were interpreting it, like how your participants would interpret it, and also whether